Good morning. Welcome to the Baker Institute. My name's Ken Medlock. I'm the director of the Center for Energy Studies here, and I'm really glad to see so many bright, shiny faces so early in the morning. We were actually just joking. We had a speaker's dinner last night, and I think it was Bill that actually commented on the wine samples that sort of came around, and that it's better to sort of host the dinner the night before and not have to get up and be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed the next morning. But I think we'll muddle through. In any case, this is the third annual conference that we've hosted looking at issues related to the global energy transition. Very proud to co-sponsor this event with Baker Botts. Long history between Baker Botts and the Baker Institute through our founding director, Secretary James Baker. You'll hear much more about that later, and actually he will be here shortly after lunch to address some issues of incredible import, to say the least. He's always a very entertaining speaker too. But a couple of housekeeping notes. As the day moves on, we will have a few coffee breaks. During the coffee breaks, I want to encourage you to actually pay attention to the screens because we this year did something a little bit different. We actually had a few films that are directly related to, and they're short films, they're 8 to 10 minutes long, but directly related to areas of research in which we're engaged, produced, and those will be showing during the coffee breaks. They're really interesting, a lot of interesting commentary and footage. I think they turned out really well, but it'll also give you some insight into the kinds of things that we're addressing in a little bit different way. So you don't have to pick up a paper and read it. You can just watch an 8-minute video. So that's always nice, I know. Aside from that, we are also honored to have with us today the Environmental Defense Fund. They are actually displaying their virtual reality methane emissions platform. So during the day, when you have time, I know during lunch, I think there are going to be 2 places set up outside in the tent, but there will be another place during the day over in 114, which is if you walk out here into the foyer and take a left. It's at the end of the hall right there. Encourage you to do that. It's really cool. And it's kind of a challenge too, because you have to actually tour a well site and figure out where all the methane leaks are. But there's also a lesson to be learned in the exercise, namely a lot of the things that you hear about that are of considerable concern can be addressed very quickly and very easily. So you'll hear more actually from EDF as well later in the day. So. And then final housekeeping note, the restrooms, men's restroom is on that side, women's is on that side of the auditorium, and I'm really looking forward to a fantastic day with all of you. With that, what I'm going to do is introduce Bill Kroger. Bill is one of the co-chairs, along with Elaine Walsh from Baker Botts, on putting the program together for today's event. He's been involved actually in the planning for this event for the last 3 years, but he somehow took the title of co-chair. So I think it was handed off to him by Stephen Miles, who was doing that the last couple of years. But been fantastic to work with them. We put together a great panel. Bill is he's a partner, senior partner at Baker Botts, and the chair of the energy practice at Baker Botts. So with that, I'm going to step aside and hand the podium to Bill.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief. I grew up in Houston and am always amazed at the kind of the new institutions and special places that we've built over the past couple of decades. And we're in one of those places. This is a very special institution for the city of Houston. And as much as anyone, it's a tribute to the man I'm going to introduce, Ambassador Edward Rogerian. He has been the director of this institute since its founding, since this foundation was poured for this institution. But he's had a remarkable career before then. He has been in public service for more than 50 years. He served as the U.S. ambassador to Israel, before then the ambassador to the Syrian Arab Republic, and before that Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs for both the George H.W. Bush administration and the Clinton administration. And so with that, it's proud for me to introduce Ambassador Rogerian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Bill put a lot of years up there, 50 years. There's a joke in the Middle East that I'm so old I can remember the Dead Sea when it was only sick. So basically, really it's a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to welcome you to Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy and what promises to be a very timely and relevant discussion on energy issues. As Ken said, this is the third annual Baker Botts Energy Conference, and we hope to deliver, as usual, original analysis on how the energy landscape in our world is changing today, along with how these challenges will affect our future. This conference is unique for bringing together legal, financial, corporate, and academic leaders to give a truly multifaceted perspective on these energy issues. Last year marked the 25th anniversary of the Baker Institute, and through these years we have remained true to our original model, being nonpartisan, think tank, building our research programs on the principle of comparative advantage, and being an integral part of Rice University and the city of Houston. Our Center for Energy Studies, led by Ken Medlock, is a prime example of our model, which draws on Houston's position as the energy capital of the world. In 2018, the Center for Energy Studies was ranked as the top energy public policy institute in the world for the second consecutive year, a distinction for which we are immensely proud. Since last year's conference, the CES has hired Michelle Foss as its fellow in energy and minerals, a key area of research, and Mark Finley as its fellow in energy and global oil, further expanding the scope of the center's research. The Baker Institute itself has also once again been ranked as the third top university-affiliated think tank in the world, preceded only by Harvard's Belfer Center, that takes the #1 spot, and the London School of Economics takes the #2 spot. We are truly honored to partner with Baker Botts for this event. Our ties with Baker Botts are very close through both our honorary chair, Secretary James A. Baker III, who will be our keynote speaker at lunch, and his grandfather, Captain Baker, who was instrumental in founding this university. Baker Botts, I don't have to tell you, is a world premier energy law firm and is very well placed to speak to global developments in the energy industry. I would like to thank Baker Botts for their long-standing relationship with and support of our institute. On that note, I am very pleased to introduce John Martin, managing partner of Baker Botts. John began his term as the firm's 15th managing partner this past April. He is succeeding Andy Baker, who will be retiring at the end of this year after 40 years of service. John has extensive experience in issues of corporate governance, and public and private M&A transactions, and we are happy to have him here today from Baker Botts' Palo Alto office. Please join me in welcoming John Martin to the podium.
Good morning. Ambassador Rogerian, thank you very much. And Ken, thank you for your leadership here. And welcome everyone to today's event. This is appropriately titled The Energy Transition, and we're going to get into a lot of great topics today. As most of you know, members of Secretary Baker's family were among the founders of our law firm. And next year, Baker Botts will celebrate our 180th anniversary. Given the role that Secretary Baker and his family have played in the firm, we are proud to be a sponsor of the Baker Institute and appreciate the opportunity to jointly develop and host this innovative conference, now in its third year. Our commitment to the Baker Institute is a reflection not only of our shared history with Secretary Baker and Rice University, which happens to be our oldest client, but also of our respect for the world-class thought leadership the Baker Institute provides on leading energy and other public policy issues. And I'd like to also thank two of our partners who have served as this year's program co-chairs. Bill Kroger, who is chair of our energy litigation practice, and Elaine Walsh. Elaine, where are you? Can you raise your hand? Elaine is chair of our power and renewables practice. And also a special thanks to our partner, Stephen Miles. Stephen has been chair for many years of our energy sector committee at Baker Botts, and he's been a real thought leader in the firm and a real driver for this program over the last few years with Ken Medlock. Recently, we have seen a period of unprecedented change in the global energy sector. These changes and others on the horizon are reasons why this event is so important. And as the leading international energy law firm, Baker Botts has had much more than a front row seat witnessing these changes. We are actively working hand in hand with our clients, including many in the room, to create a competitive advantage by leveraging and adapting to a rapidly changing environment. A few of the macroeconomic trends driving end-user demand in energy include the fact that electricity demand is projected to double by 2050, with renewables projected to make up more than 50% of generation by 2035. We're seeing more dismantling of cost-inefficient assets impacted by changing customer behaviors and new regulations. And we're seeing increasing consolidation of oilfield services companies to meet scale requirements and cost efficiencies. The current energy landscape clearly presents some challenges, but many great opportunities also exist. And Baker Botts is well positioned to help our clients navigate the rapidly changing technology affecting the industry. For more than a century, our energy and natural resources lawyers have represented a wide variety of energy sector clients in more than 120 countries. It's one reason Baker Botts has a reputation as, quote, an energy powerhouse, according to Chambers and Partners. And we have earned the highest honors of our energy practices from Chambers, Legal 500, and U.S. News and World Report. We've also had the privilege recently to represent clients in some of the largest and most transformative energy deals and litigation matters. We have a robust renewable energy practice, having acted as transaction or development counsel to more than 100 renewable energy projects, covering wind, solar, biomass, hydroelectric, and geothermal projects, and associated battery storage solutions. And a few of our major clients in this space include Sonova, EDF Renewables, Clearway Energy, and Hannon Armstrong. Our nationwide M&A team is advising BP in the sale of all of its upstream and midstream business in Alaska for $5.6 billion. This was announced several weeks ago. And this is a globally significant mandate for BP, representing a key component of its $10 billion strategic asset divestment program. On the litigation side, we recently obtained the dismissal of a high-profile lawsuit filed against Kinder Morgan Texas Pipeline and Permian Highway Pipeline. And the lawsuit attempted to enjoin the companies from constructing and operating a $2 billion, 400-mile pipeline that is critical to the Texas economy. We also have been advising Sempra on its LNG projects, valued at over $5 billion. For example, we're currently counseling Sempra on the development and marketing of the ECA mid-scale liquefaction facility, which will be a first-of-its-kind LNG export facility in Mexico. With an incredible lineup of speakers and panelists today, we will explore the fast-changing energy landscape and do our part to help you understand how to best position your business for the future. The opening keynote speaker will be Jason Klein, VP of Energy Transitions at Shell. And later in the day, our partner, Secretary Baker, will present the keynote address on energy transformation and U.S. foreign policy. The list of industry-leading thought leaders speaking today is beyond impressive. So it should come as no surprise that this event, once again, is sold out. We are delighted to be co-hosting this event with the Baker Institute and look forward to our continued collaboration with them and with our clients for many years to come. Thank you and enjoy the conference.
So now I'd like to invite Jason Klein up to the stage with me. We're actually going to sit and do a little armchair discussion. I think it'll be quite interesting. There's a lot of stuff going on. By way of introduction, Jason is the Vice President of Energy Transitions at Shell, which is perfect given the theme of the conference today. The oil and gas industry will play a significant part in facilitating the energy transition. And you see this actually across the board with different companies and the types of investments they're making, and hopefully we'll get into some of those issues today. So, Jason, please. Well, first of all, welcome.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's great to be
here. The topic of energy transitions is pervasive, right? It's something that is discussed in many different venues around the world. And one of the things that is often true of those discussions is they differ depending on where you are. It sort of has led me to, stating something that's fairly obvious, which is you view the world from where you sit. And certainly Shell, being an international, vertically integrated major in the oil and gas space, understands the dynamics that exist around the world, particularly with regard to energy transitions. I guess one of the things I just want to open with is, when you think about energy transitions, what does that mean to Shell, and how is Shell positioning itself to provide energy services as we move forward?
Yeah, so I think you hit the key point, which is it's not one transition. Every country is going through a different transition, and the outcomes are not going to be uniform. Here in the US, it's made more complicated because different parts of the country are going through different transitions. So at Shell, we look at how our customers' needs are evolving and how their energy requirements are evolving, and we will slowly be evolving our portfolio of products and investments to match where our customers are going.
So not too long ago, we had one of your colleagues, Wim Thomas, here to talk about the sky scenario. It received a lot of attention by various media outlets and also a lot of faculty and students here at Rice, as well as the general community. And one thing that is certainly true of scenarios, and this was raised over and over again despite how it was written up ex post, scenarios are meant to provide a signpost for what needs to happen for a particular outcome. They're not necessarily a forecast. But that said, the sky scenario had some really interesting lessons, if you will. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and how it's helping to shape what Shell is doing.
Yeah, so first of all, as you say, it's not a forecast and it's not our business plan, but the sky scenario shows a technically possible, but nonetheless challenging pathway to deliver on the promises of the Paris Agreement. And what we can learn from that is that it's going to take massive collaboration between society, governments, consumers, and businesses to achieve this outcome. And what you really need to do is have a rewiring of the global economy in just 50 years. And it's a massive undertaking. Some key themes that come out of the sky scenario are the role of natural gas as a transition fuel, and it's a story of deep electrification across all sectors. The 7 kind of key elements that we think are necessary to deliver sky, one is deep electrification. We need to triple the rate of electrification of final energy. It's a story of renewables growth. We need to increase renewables 50-fold. Right now, wind and solar, don't even ticket 2% of global energy supply. We need a step change in energy efficiency globally to bring that down, to improve energy efficiency and bring demand down. We need carbon capture and storage at a massive scale. So we need about, in Sky, that pathway shows 10,000 CCS facilities the size of our Quest facility in Canada. It's a story of nature-based solutions. We must end deforestation in order to address the challenge. And we think and many experts agree that global carbon pricing is going to be necessary to achieve most of these outcomes. But fundamentally, that's underpinned in all cases by consumer mindset. Consumers are going to need to demand lower carbon offerings. They're going to need to demand from their policymakers regulatory reform to deliver lower carbon outcomes.
So you touched on several topics when you think about the sky scenario and sort of how that's shaping the view of the world from Shell's perspective. I wonder if we could sort of dive into those a little bit. One of which, comment about electrification. That is certainly a rapid increase in electrification globally. I think right now, globally, of total primary energy that's actually used, about 43% of it is electricity. So you're talking about a significant increase. Right? Yeah. So when you think about what that means and how energy companies of today are thinking about the future and repositioning themselves to provide reliable electricity services, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the types of investments that Shell is actually making.
Yeah, so we have committed in this decade up to $2 billion a year in new energies, and we've set out that for the first half of the next decade, we aim to invest up to $2 to $3 billion a year in our emerging power business. The investments we've made in just the last few years, which will give you a flavor of what we're doing, we acquired MP2, which is a commercial and industrial retail power provider here in Texas. We acquired Greenlots, which is an EV charging company in California. We acquired Sonnen, which is a home battery storage company. We acquired a big stake in Silicon Ranch, which is utility-grade solar installations. And we've acquired residential retail power companies in Australia, in the UK, and another EV charging company in Europe. And we've also started building out some hydrogen infrastructure in California. So we've been acquiring a lot of the pieces of the puzzle in the power business. And here in North America, Shell is one of the top three and has been one of the top three gas and power traders in the wholesale markets for a long time. So we're building the tools and the platforms to kind of evolve the power system.
So the step into renewables, that's obvious, sizable investments there. But you also touched a little bit on hydrogen and natural gas, which are not two, distinctly different fuels, because most of hydrogen we get today is through steam reformation of methane. So I wonder if you could dive in a little bit on where you envision natural gas going in terms of the energy transition and facilitating a move to a lower carbon future.
So we see natural gas as a key transition fuel, both domestically and as LNG around the world. When burned for power, natural gas has about half the greenhouse gas emissions of coal. So when we look at the developing world, where a lot of the demand growth, or most of the demand growth is going to come from, we see the ability to provide LNG and natural gas to offset coal, and also to complement the intermittency of renewables. But I think when we talk about natural gas, we also need to talk about environmental regulations and how we ensure that the environmental story around natural gas is credible. Here in the US, we have vocally supported regulation of fugitive methane, both at existing and modified onshore sources, which has the federal government has gone the opposite direction, which has really forced us and some of our colleagues to move into voluntary regimes. So we are a member of the non-binding methane guiding principles. We're a founding member of Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which has a target of 0.25% fugitive methane across the value chain. Shell has set a more aggressive target for ourselves of 0.2% fugitive methane across our entire value chain in natural gas from Shell-operated ventures by 2025. And we think it's really important, if natural gas is going to play a role in this transition and be seen as credible as an environmentally friendly fossil fuel, we've got to ensure that we as an industry are being good stewards of that value chain.
Sure. So one of the other things you raised, and it ties directly to this part of the discussion, in talking about the sky scenario, is the expanded use of carbon capture.
Yeah.
Rice, here at Rice, we're actually engaged on a number of fronts related to carbon capture. It's an interesting conversation because when you start talking about carbon capture and recognize that there is a big study being done at the national level looking at federal guidelines to sort of help propel CCS and CCUS, which is the utilization of CO2. But a lot of times when you get into implementation, you get into a discussion that's much more local because politics are local. So if you're talking about infrastructure development, inevitably you end up talking to county officials, state officials, and in fact, here in the state of Texas, we're really heavily involved in a process that OGCI is part of, but also several NGOs and foundations looking at ways to provide policy guidance to state lawmakers, which is an interesting discussion because for those of you who don't know, it has previously almost been impossible to talk about climate at the state governor's level. I will tell you that door has been knocked down. We recently had a meeting with the governor's office that was very successful, and we have follow-up planned. So it's a pretty successful venture. But what drives that is the business prospect, right, of carbon capture for the state of Texas, where the oil and gas industry, both direct and indirect, accounts for about 1/5 of the Texas economy. So you can't get away from it. That said, most of the demand growth, and this is really important because all of that oil and gas production is increasingly outwardly facing from the state of Texas. And most of that demand growth, you hit on it, right, is coming from the developing world. You think about developing Asia. I mean, the developing world, you get outside of the OECD, accounts for about 6.4 billion people. The OECD is roughly 1.3 billion, so it becomes a numbers game at some point. And growth in the rest of the world is going to drive significant increases in demand. And it's hard to envision a future where you don't have fossil fuels as part of it. And so that means carbon capture becomes incredibly important. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you mentioned the project in Canada, but a little bit about some of the things that are going on in Shell in that space.
Yeah, so I mean, clearly there is a role for oil and gas in a net zero world to address these hard to abate sectors where dense energy molecules are required. So you need some negative emissions to get to that net zero world, and CCS is one of the main opportunities there. CCS requires government support. It requires collaboration to get to the scale. When we look at it, and so here in the U.S., the 45Q regulations came out a year or so ago, provide some fiscal incentives. We're very much involved in the National Petroleum Council study that will be going to Secretary Perry soon, which outlines what needs to happen to really make the U.S. compete. If you look at what do you need for a CCS project? Well, you need high concentrations of CO2. You need a friendly regulatory regime for permitting pipelines and injection wells and the like, and you need a lot of engineering expertise. Well, if we can't find that in Houston, Texas, I don't know how CCS is going to work globally. So, we have plenty of CO2 on the ship channel and plenty of engineers in the energy corridor, and we do have a friendly regulatory regime. So, we see this as a prime opportunity, but it will involve collaboration, which is why we're working with yourself and others to figure out how we scale that. Our project in Canada has sequestered about over 4 million tons to date of CO2 off our Scotford upgrader facility. We're participating in CCS projects in other countries, and we're trying to look at how can we reduce the cost of the capture and how we identify the right reservoirs and aquifers or enhanced oil projects to use that CO2 and drive the cost down.
So you mentioned another method of carbon capture, which was broadly defined as nature-based solutions. And I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that, because there is an active contingent, as you know, here at Rice that is looking at a variety of options on that front.
So we see nature-based solutions as one of those kind of 7 key elements. It's hard to get to a pathway of net zero without nature-based solutions. So 1 is ending deforestation, and then 2 is using nature to capture more CO2. In Europe, in parts of Europe now, when you go to your local Shell station, if you buy regular unleaded, we give you the option of buying a nature-based offset at the pump, where we will fund through third parties reforestation efforts that offset the amount of CO2 that you have just acquired at the pump. And if you buy our premium V-Power, we'll pay for that for you. We're seeing how that's being adopted. On the technical side, a lot of our R&D team are working on technologies to, one, improve the capture capabilities of existing nature-based solutions, and also to figure out what the next set of nature-based solutions is beyond just planting forest. And we're doing a lot of R&D around measurement and verification, because we need to demonstrate to consumers and the broad public that nature-based solutions work and they are capturing that carbon and sequestering it permanently, and that we can demonstrate that through science.
Yes, along those lines, we actually have one of our scholars is looking at, and he actually launched a program that looks at how you alter land use patterns to actually increase soil retention of carbon. And what's remarkable about that is there's not really a widely accepted metric or set of standards, right? And I think that's an area to watch really intensely.
I think in the U.S., given our agricultural heartland, the opportunity set is massive. Yeah. It's clear through a lot of the work going on across the U.S. that there is an opportunity through better land use management to capture a lot more CO2 through agricultural practices. And that's why we're working a lot on this measurement and verification, so we can demonstrate scientifically that these new practices, compared to the practices of today, are capturing more CO2 in the soil permanently.
So measurement and verification, I'm going to expand that a little bit, right? How does Shell, so Shell has a sustainable development report, right?
Yeah.
Sustainability report, and as do most companies today. And what's always interesting in those is there's a lot of discussion, and this is not specific to Shell, but about various programs that are ongoing around the world to not only reduce carbon footprint, achieve environmental sustainability, but also expand access to energy. Yeah. And just a very basic question, how does that fit with what Shell's doing, and how do you actually track progress? What are your metrics for success in that domain?
So first, let's talk about energy access. So right now, there are 2 billion people in the world who don't have access to reliable electricity, and 1 billion who have no access to electricity. This is where the demand growth is going to be. This is why most experts think that energy demand is going to double from 2000 to 2050, which is why our purpose is providing more and cleaner energy. When we think about the developing world and those 2 billion people, that's where a lot of the effort needs to go, to bring these people out of energy poverty. That is one of the goals of the Paris Agreement. It's not just a 2 degrees C, it's all the sustainable development goals, including eliminating energy poverty. We have set an ambition to, by 2030, bring 100 million people reliable electricity that don't have that today. And we think that existing solutions like microgrids and distributed solar are the best, and we're moving in that space. In terms of measuring how Shell is doing, we have set a net carbon footprint ambition, which is looking at the intensity of the energy, the greenhouse gas intensity of the energy we provide our customers. And we've set a target of a 20% reduction of our net carbon footprint by 2035, and by reducing by about half by 2050. But important in that is that we include the emissions from our customers. So when you buy a gallon of V-Power at your local Shell station, the CO2 that comes out of your tailpipe, we include in our net carbon footprint. So we're committing to reduce our emissions and our customers' emissions over that time period. And 85% of our emissions, roughly, are coming from our customers, not from our own operations. But we've also recognized that setting a target for 2035 and 2050, it's hard to measure that and know if we're on track. So this last year, we've committed to rolling 3-year targets, binding 3-year targets, and tied our executive compensation to that. So at the end of 2019, we have set an ambition, a target of 2 to 3% net carbon footprint reduction from 2016. And next year, our executives' bonuses will be tied to whether or not we've achieved that 2 to 3% reduction. And every year, we'll set a new target on a rolling 3-year basis to hold ourselves accountable on that.
That's very interesting. I don't think we need to sort of dive into the motivations for Shell's position, right? Those are pretty clear. I mean, governments around the world are really taking a much more staunch position with regard to environmental sustainability, trying to achieve net zero carbon by 2050 or 2040 or 2035, just depends on where you are, right? But the one thing that's interesting is every company is sort of acting on their own accord, given that shifting competitive landscape across the energy space. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit on how what you're doing is potentially providing leadership for your peers and how you're engaged with your peers. You mentioned OGCI, but I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that as well.
So we're doing what we think is right to help society deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement, and that clearly requires collaboration from governments, societies, customers, and businesses. So we are doing what we think we can to influence good policy and influence good practice and to help consumers make that transition. We can't do it alone. So we think, and what Sky demonstrates is we need collaboration with everyone if we're going to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. So we aim to set ambitions and targets and encourage our competitors to adopt similar targets and ambitions. We work through things like the methane guiding principles and OGCI to develop standards and to support good policy. We work in coalitions with all sorts of industries around carbon pricing and how we could adopt good carbon pricing, which is a key element to getting there. But we fundamentally are trying to move with society and adapt our portfolio to the changing needs of society as we evolve through the transition.
So I'm going to pick up on a key word there. You mentioned portfolio.
Yeah.
And I think in a lot of discussions around the energy transition, that aspect of the conversation is lost. A lot of times people will cast it as an all or nothing for a particular fuel source type of discussion. And in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. But part of the title of today's event, the energy transition, but it's really focused on legacy, scale, and technology. Shell is a historically an oil and gas company, vertically integrated major, massive international presence in multiple countries around the world. As a result of that, significant legacy of assets in place. And as you think about what the future will bring, you also have to be conscious of what that means for existing assets and how you can actually bring scale to addressing demands of customers everywhere through new technology. So, the conversation really has to be one about a portfolio approach, and I think you've highlighted that. But just to summarize, that part of the discussion, I think for emphasis, it's very important. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about just what portfolio means?
Yeah. So first of all, to be clear, there's a role for oil and gas for many, many years to come to address, even in a net zero scenario, to address these hard to abate sectors, whether that's commercial aviation, long distance freight, shipping, petrochemicals, steel, cement. There's just a lot of hard to abate sectors. And to the extent that people continue to need oil and gas, Shell's going to continue to provide it. But we see that the global the global demand for energy in different forms is evolving and will continue to evolve at different paces in different parts of the world, and we intend to evolve with it. And the way we look at that is by adjusting our capital investment allocations. And so what you've seen is, as I mentioned earlier, we're currently investing up to $1 to $2 billion a year in new energies. We've highlighted to our investor community that the first half of the next decade, we're looking at about up to $3 billion a year in the power portfolio. And that's out of a total capital allocation in that period of approximately $30 billion a year. So I would say it's measured. We're moving at pace with society, encouraging society to move quicker, because every year that goes by and we don't have action in some of these areas, the challenge of Paris becomes harder. But we are trying to adapt through that time period with our customers.
Excellent. We're up against it, so please everybody join me in thanking Jason for joining us.
Thank you.
Fantastic conversation. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to step to the podium briefly while the stage is flipped for our panel. The panel it's going to build very nicely on the discussion we just had. Its focus is the current state of the energy transition. It's going to be moderated by Liz Flannery. She's a partner at Baker Botts. While we're flipping the stage, Liz, if you want to come up and introduce your panelists, that would be great. I'll make a couple of remarks before you jump up here. I just want to reiterate, definitely during coffee breaks, please pay attention. The films that we produce, we think they're a fantastic way to actually demonstrate the type of research that we're doing, as well as convey some pretty powerful messages in non-technical ways. So they're consumable by pretty much everybody. Matter of fact, I'm gonna get my kids to watch them, the ones who are in middle school right now. So they'll give me an honest opinion, right? So it's always good. And then beyond that, I really encourage everybody to look at the virtual reality or participate in the virtual reality experience that the Environmental Defense Fund has here. It's, Jason and I chat a little bit about methane and the targets that are in place. And I think one of the things you'll gather from participating in that experience is exactly what you can do to achieve those goals. It's actually not that difficult. And as a result, I think very achievable. And it really highlights the role that natural gas can play as we go forward through this ever-evolving energy landscape. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Liz. And Liz, if you want to take the stage, it's all yours.
Good morning. I'm Liz Flannery. I'm a partner at Baker Botts in the Houston office. I'm in the intellectual property department, so my practice is mostly patents, patent litigation and prosecution. I also co-chair the energy IP practice at Baker Botts, and so very happy to be here, very happy to be hosting and moderating this very distinguished panel of experts. Our topic for today is the current state of the energy transition, new technology, policy intervention, and the pace of change. If I can figure out how to get this slide up. Thank you. While we're getting the slide set up, we'll have a couple of topics that we're going to talk about, trying to look at various aspects of technology, policy, and market forces that are impacting the energy transition and where those stand today to hopefully set the stage for later discussions today about where those various aspects of the energy transition are headed. I'll start introducing some of my panel here, and I think they're all standing, waiting to come on up. I'll start out with Mark Finley. Mark, I think we've got our first chair set up if you want to come on up. Mark is the fellow in energy and global oil here at the Rice University Baker Institute. Mark has 35 years of experience working at the intersections of energy, economics, and public policy. Mark recently joined the Baker Institute. Prior to that, he was the senior U.S. economist at BP, where he was responsible for the company's long and short-term market analysis and led the production of the BP Statistical Review of World Energy, the world's longest-running compilation of objective global energy data. Prior to that, Mark was an analyst and manager at the U.S. CIA. He was responsible for assessing the implications for U.S. strategic concerns, development in the global oil and other energy markets. So welcome, Mark. Next, I'd like to invite John Berger up to the stage. John is the co-founder and CEO of Sonova Energy. And since founding the company in 2012, he has also served as the president and chairman of the board. John has more than 2 decades of experience in the electric power industry, including serving as the founder and CEO of SunCap Financial, a residential and solar power service company. John also founded Standard Renewable Energy, which offered renewable energy and energy-efficient products. So welcome, John. Next, we've asked for Joanna Schmidtke. You want to come on up? Joanna is a principal at Era Partners, which is a private equity investment firm based here in Houston. Prior to joining Era, Joanna was a director at Saudi Aramco Energy Ventures, a corporate venture subsidiary of Saudi Aramco. She led investments in technology-driven solutions, including upstream and downstream oil and gas, petrochemicals, cybersecurity, and additive manufacturing. Welcome. And finally, Hap Ellis. Hap, there you are. Hap is a general partner at Rockport Capital, which is a multi-stage venture capital firm. Hap previously worked at Knoll International and at Kennetech Corporation, which at that time was the leading wind development and turbine manufacturer, and helped position that company in anticipation of an IPO. So welcome, Hap. Do we have all of our microphones and everything in place before we begin? Looks right. Well, as I mentioned, very honored to be moderating this very distinguished panel of speakers. Our slide, which provides an overview of the topics that we're going to talk about, is up on the screen. We do anticipate having some time for audience questions at the end. So as we're going through the topics, be thinking of your questions, and we will invite those at the end of our discussion. So I'll start out with a bit of an overview. So just sort of to the panelists, and I'll ask Mark to get us started on this, sort of viewing the current state of energy sources at the macro level. Where do the different sources, traditional oil and gas, coal, renewables, et cetera, stand in relative terms of adoption and use, and sort of what general trends have emerged both nationally and internationally in that respect?
Great. Thank you, Liz. As I prepared my remarks and we thought about this panel, I found myself thinking, as you see on the slide, well, which transition are we actually talking about here? And I do believe that it's important that we cast our intellectual nets broadly as we think about this idea of an energy transition and the ramifications of it, and the various facets of it that we'll be exploring today. So I think the first transition, and what most of us think that we're here to discuss today, is the transition of the U.S. and global energy system to a lower carbon future. So what is the status of that? I think the status is we've got our work cut out for us. Renewables are growing very rapidly, as we've already discussed, but this is still a U.S. and world energy system that is dominated by fossil fuels. Today, about 87 or 85% of the world's energy comes from fossil sources. We've made progress. 20 years ago, that was 87%, so slow progress. Now, the share of fossil energy has been declining, but in absolute terms, they're still growing. And as a result, CO2 emissions around the world are still growing at record levels. Here in the United States, emissions are still below the 2005 peak, but even here, they've been growing in the last couple of years. Where do we go from here, from this starting point? I think, as Jason's already discussed, most energy analysts are expecting that in the future, renewables will continue to grow very rapidly and to gain market share, especially wind and solar. And we'll hear more about the prospects of that from other panelists and from other speakers during the day. But history shows that these transitions take time. Up until now, in the history of the world's economic development, the fuel that gained market share most rapidly was oil, and it took oil more than 40 years to get to 10% of the world's energy mix. No other form of energy got to 10% of the world's energy mix within 50 years of its introduction. Now, we don't have 50 years of history with renewables at scale, or at least the renewables that we're talking about here today, wind and solar in particular. Non-hydro commercial renewable energy is about 5% of the energy mix today. As we heard already in the conversations, even in scenarios for the future that are successful in dealing with the challenge of reducing CO2 emissions, there's still a big role to play for fossil fuels. In fact, the International Energy Agency's Sustainable Development Scenario, which is fully consistent with meeting the Paris climate objectives, has fossil fuels contributing the majority of the world's energy in 2040. And remember, that's a success scenario that will take a lot more work, more policy, more innovation, more investment. And so even in that success scenario, there is a huge role for fossil fuels to play in the world's energy system in the future. And I don't need to tell people in this room what that means for investment. Given the underlying decline rates of the production base of the world's oil and natural gas system, even in a scenario that is consistent with meeting the Paris objectives, trillions of dollars of new investment are required in future production of oil and gas, in addition to the trillions of dollars of investment that will be needed in new energy forms and efficiency, et cetera. And that's just one vector of transition. Another dimension of energy transition is the ongoing shift of where the demand is located. It's no longer here in the other rich countries of the world. China surpassed the United States as the biggest consumer of energy a decade ago, and now it consumes 40% more energy than the US does. In fact, about 25% of all the world's energy consumption is in China. The United States and other members of the OECD, the industrialized countries of the world, North America, Europe, Japan, only consume 40% of the world's energy today. And most expectations are that all of the future growth of the world's energy demand will not be here either, will be in those rapidly growing emerging economies. So the bottom line is, what happens here matters less and less in the global context. It also means that in addition to the focus on climate, there will be a growing focus on the importance of energy in lifting people out of poverty and improving quality of life around the world, an equally important objective of the world's energy system. Another vector of transition is really important here in the United States. It's the shift of the United States from being the world's biggest energy importer to becoming a significant exporter. A lot of this is driven by the shale revolution, and again, I don't need to tell people in this room about that. The United States is now the biggest producer of oil and gas in the world. In 2018, the United States saw the single biggest annual increase in production of oil and natural gas of any country ever in the history of the planet. These are just huge changes, on the back of which the United States is now a net exporter of natural gas and of coal, is on a trajectory, according to our friends in the U.S. Energy Department, of becoming self-sufficient in oil as soon as next year. This is very different from other major economic centers. Europe, China, India, Japan, all heavily dependent on imported energy and generally getting more so over time. Now, again, I would draw a distinction between self-sufficiency and independence. Even as the U.S. moves, for example, toward being self-sufficient on net terms in oil production and consumption, the U.S. last year still imported 10 million barrels a day of crude oil and refined products. And so, as recent events have shown, U.S.'s consumers are still connected to global energy market developments. Now, what are the ramifications of this transition in the U.S. energy system? Obviously, huge implications for investment, for economic vitality. Secretary Baker will tell us about the geopolitical and strategic ramifications of this for U.S. security posture around the world. There are some hidden ramifications that I don't think people have really focused on. 15 years ago, energy imports were half of America's trade deficit. As the U.S. moves toward becoming self-sufficient, I think it's reasonable to conclude that the recent strengthening of the U.S. dollar relative to other currencies is at least in part due to the U.S. energy renaissance. And what are the economic ramifications of that for our trade competitiveness? Renewables production is growing rapidly here as it is elsewhere around the world. And that's a domestically produced source of energy as well. But again, where do the wind turbines come from? The solar panels, the batteries, the base metals. My colleague here at the Institute, Michelle Foss, will have some comments on that in a panel later today. And that raises my final point, which is, as we think about all of these different dimensions of transition, one thing we should keep in mind is the broader ramifications of that. Let me focus very briefly on just one slice of that, which is energy security. Even with growing self-sufficiency in energy, recent events have shown that U.S. consumers and businesses are still exposed to global shocks. On the oil front, we've had 50 years to work on this. We have 50 years worth of practice. We have institutions, policies to deal with the risks that are inherent in the energy system for oil. We have strategic stockpiles. We have treaty obligations with other members of the International Energy Agency. The government of Saudi Arabia and their state oil company have invested strategically in maintaining a buffer of spare capacity to deal with shocks. Where is any of this infrastructure for other forms of energy? As we embark on an energy transition, growing renewables is great for reducing oil vulnerability to the extent they back oil out of the world's energy system, but they run the risk of potentially introducing new vulnerabilities. And I guess my concluding point would be, we need to think about those security implications of the energy transition and begin now to work on strategies here in the United States and around the world to understand, to mitigate, and to manage potential new vulnerabilities. So again, as we kick off our discussion of the transition, my point would be to let's keep our mind open to the broad dimensions of this energy transition, and the various facets of it, as we think through these problems. Thanks. Hope that's a good kickoff.
Yes, Mark, thank you very much for that overview. And at this time, I kind of want to open it up to the panel. If any of you wanted to pick up on any of those specific points, I had a couple of questions to follow up on, but I sort of wanted it to open up to any of you all that had points that you wanted to follow up on Mark's overview.
The coffee hasn't kicked in yet.
Yeah, I understand. Well, I actually have a question, and I'd throw this to the panel. Mark, you can take it, or others can take it as well. With regard to, emerging markets, you talked about how that's going to be where a lot of the demand is. Do any of you have any comments, either observations of trends or anecdotes in terms of those countries' preferences or sort of leanings in terms of renewables versus more traditional energy sources, and sort of what the experience has been there?
Are you looking at me?
Well, if you have some comments, we're happy to have them.
No, I said to Liz when we were planning the panel, I think I've been in the renewable business for a long time, or around it, or in it for a long time. And so back in the days when we first started out in the wind sector in the early 90s, we called ourselves wind weenies. So it's a true wind weenie. I stood up in a conference when somebody was talking about the need to bring renewable energy to the underdeveloped world. And I stood up and said, I've got a question. I don't know that they need renewables at this stage of their growth. They need baseload cheap power, and that might be coal. I don't think Jason, there's enough LNG facilities in underdeveloped countries to provide gas, although that'd be much better than coal. And so I said, it reminded me of a snippet that's on YouTube at Davos last year or this year, where the Prime Minister of Bangladesh basically took on all comers about the fact that they're building a big state-of-the-art coal facility, and she basically said, "We need this power. We need this cheap baseload power, and we need a lot of it to get our economy growing." And it's a challenge. Given Jason was so articulate and he laid out what we have to do to meet the Paris Accords. And on the other hand, and as we all know, I'm sure in this room, China's made an art form out of using coal to get where they want to get with their economy.
Right.
And it's a challenge.
It is. China consumes half of the coal on the planet. But China is also the biggest producer of nuclear energy in the world, or one of the largest. It has the biggest growth program of nuclear energy, hydroelectricity, and is the biggest producer of new renewable energy as well. So growing very rapidly. Partly that is motivated by climate considerations. Partly it's industrial policy and competitiveness strategy. Partly it's local air pollution, which is a significant driver in many parts of the world as well. So I think I guess where I would come back is to say, renewable energy, the data is very clear, it's not only a game for the rich countries anymore, partly because the costs have come down, partly because other countries are getting richer. China is now a middle-income country. But at the same time, climate considerations are one of a list of policy priorities around the world, and it's I think wrong of us to say you can't get rich until we get the climate game solved. Sorry, that's an equally important aspiration that we have to honor and address as well.
I think that's right. Well, let's move on to another more of our more specific topics. One thing that we wanted to look at was sort of the role of the state regulatory response in the energy transition. And so one question I wanted to pose, how have regulatory agencies responded to and shaped the energy transition so far? And sort of what challenges do those regulations present in the industry? John, if you wanted to start us off on that.
I'll give it a stab. In terms of the power industry in the United States, we are uniquely screwed up, as I would say. We have about 5,000 utilities of various different regulatory structures, namely the investor-owned utilities, IOUs, co-ops, munis, and then even the federally owned entities, BPA, TVA. So we don't have a consistent policy. Truth is, pretty funny here too, is that Texas is actually non-jurisdictional to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. There is no grid in terms of how that's commented upon. We are basically a bunch of balkanized regional grids. And those are becoming more and more balkanized or more regional in nature, not less. Not less. So I think what this leads to is that when you start looking at the regulatory structure, the Federal Power Act of 35 and its amendments over the years actually is a very weak regulatory body within Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And the states, the public utility commissions, actually hold a lot of the authority. Now, there's also a lot of norms within the regulatories when you really dig in deep. For instance, the monopoly right that utilities, and I know everybody takes for granted, is less of a divine or obligation or by law or just set that this is always going to be the case in some states versus others. So simply put, we've seen some challenges to the monopoly right, and I do feel like that's going to escalate. The other thing about it is that when you look at some of the policies, for instance, in my world, net energy metering. So this is basically allowing the solar systems that we put on homes to swing off the grid for free, and essentially treating the grid in that particular case, like in this case, CenterPoint's system, as a battery. That is, in its aggregate, influences wholesale pricing and therefore should be for jurisdictional. It is not because of a norm that's been set up years ago between the FERC and the PUCs. The flip side of that is, unlike oil and gas, intrastate lines are FERC jurisdictional, whereas they're not jurisdictional to the PUCs. That's not entirely clear. There's another one that's not entirely clear, which is the authority of contracts for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission versus bankruptcy court, which is being fought out right now by the PG&E bankruptcy. So there didn't need to really be an understanding of this because it was thought unthinkable that utilities were going to go bankrupt. It has now become thinkable, and it's happening, and there's no rule that's clear, and this may be something that goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court to decide, or certainly needs another law passed by Congress. So all that leads to is, like I said, you've got a mess. Everybody agrees the system's broken. Everybody has a different view depending upon where they're coming from about how to fix it. Some people detest what we did here in Texas, and to be clear, when we say Texas, it is literally a tale of two cities. Houston, Dallas has a deregulated with poles and wires, and then Austin, San Antonio is completely still vertically integrated and regulated by the municipalities. So even in Texas, we have a very different regulatory system. And what that will lead to is that there will be very different viewpoints about whether our test, if you will, our system in Houston and Dallas actually works. You've seen a lot of pushback there. Or do we need to go back to fully regulated? I made some comments over the last year I was here on one aspect of the regulatory that we're starting to see, and that is for those of you in oil and gas who love the regulated power industry, who don't like companies like Sonova coming in and doing residential solar and batteries behind the meter, you better pay attention to what's going on. What's happening is that the decline, as much as there's talk about the growth in the energy demand, which is true, but the overall conventional, particularly centralized power growth, is declining in some cases very rapidly in some states, Hawaii, California, the Northeast, et cetera. And that means that the earnings power of these monopolies has been dropping. This is part of the problem with PG&E. And what these utilities have turned to, and I'd say an example here is Nevada, NV Energy. That fight that was to push back deregulation bill that reached all the way to the second vote of the population of the voters was defeated because the NV Energy made a deal with the environmental NGOs to basically say, okay, if you promise NV Energy to go out and put a lot of utility scale solar and wind, we will back and defeat consumer choice. And that's indeed what happened. So what that means is the utilities are going to start, and they've already started this, to go out there and more rapidly, and we've seen this, decommission coal plants and start to decommission gas plants in the favor of brand new solar and wind projects and storage projects, because that's where the money is. So look again, the tables are shifting here. Take a step back. Who you thought were your friends may not be your friends anymore, and who you thought were your foes may not be your foes anymore. It's a different regime, and I think it's quite exciting what we're going to see, but we're definitely going to see a lot of change in the next few years.
Are there any particular states, excuse me, that you think are, adopting changes, or adopting regulation schemes that you think maybe provide a good contrast to what we're doing in Texas, or maybe have chances of better success? Do you see examples of that out in the U.S.?
Well, I think California is interesting. Who knows where that ultimately lands. I mean, California is California, right? But we do a lot of business there, and I would say that they will call it something completely different, because to say that they'll do the same thing as Houston and Dallas is probably something that no politician there wants to ever say. But it does look like, the monopoly right was granted to utilities a long time ago because of the poles and wires. It was deemed a social good to have one wire go to one home. And so it is likely, I think, this is our view, that the California system may go to poles and wires of the monopolies, and how that they may be allowed to combine or even go into the independent system or organizations or regional transmission organizations that were set up in the late 90s and early O's. They may become quasi-statalized, or regionalized or nationalized, what do you want to do? And then the generation and the consumers would be basically deregulated and allowed to have consumer choice. You've seen that in California with what they call the CCAs, which is another reason for the PG&E and the other utilities in California to be in such financial distress, is that effectively California has been and going down this path for a long time, looking more like Houston and Dallas than they would care to admit. And I think that what we do in terms of distributed solar and now storage, which storage is critically important, I know we'll talk about that later, what we're doing is we're accelerating that trend and transition. So I think California, as always, what happens there will spread. We're seeing some of these kind of indications of just poles and wires and letting the consumers choose and the generation to be deregulated, a little bit in the Northeast as well. But we'll see what happens. But there does seem somewhat of a trend towards moving towards that consumer choice aspect with regards to generation and signing up for your power supplier.
Yeah. Any comments, thoughts from the panel on what John was? Yeah, Mark.
Thanks, John. I was struck by your comment that there is no such thing as a national grid, and that the system's actually getting more balkanized. And from the way you said it, it sounds like there's a cost to that. I guess I would say, what's the prize to be gained from greater, nationwide integration of a grid, if it could be done?
Well, I'm not sure that it really makes, in many cases, makes sense cost effectively. What traditionally what utility executives did was, if say HAP owned a utility, we've known each other for a long time, next door, and HAP and I like each other, which we do, right, HAP? Then I would throw a line over to HAP, and he would throw a line to me, and I get my respective PUCs and his, they would agree to this. If we didn't like each other, then the lines wouldn't get connected. And indeed, this is what happened with the ERCOT situation. I mean, the rallying cry was, we don't want the blank Yankees to get our lignite. And so we didn't connect with them. And so it was really a haphazard system that was put together to begin with. So this idea that there was a lot of build out is not true, with the exception that the Tennessee Valley Authority in the 1960s and 70s laid out all these lines for the nuclear fleet to be built, because remember, it was going to be too cheap to meter. And then 3 Mile Island happened and all that went away. And it took to the late 90s to actually utilize that transmission build out that the TVA put in place, and it was paid obviously by federal taxpayers. So I think there's a benefit for wind, for instance. There's been some challenge, Michael Skelly, who's been a book about that, about all the challenges going on of trying to build these long transmission lines for wind. I think that's beneficial. But I think practically you also have to look at this and say, a power line crossing somebody's ranch who's been in the family for 100 years is a problem. It's a cost. And just condemning the land And running that line across has a real true cost to it. It's not just people not wanting development. And that cost needs to be put into your factoring as far as what you're going to do in the transmission lines. And the resource of solar is very distributed, decentralized. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to be running a lot of power lines to put these big solar farms in place. Now, the utilities, if we had one, we usually have a utility executive here. I'm going to miss that this year, but they'll say, no, we need to do that. The cost is absolutely here, and we need to be able to spend a lot more money, and $3 trillion or $4 trillion or $5 trillion needs to go in. And I would say, whoa, time out, cowboy. Look at this. Look at what we can do with new technology. What you've been doing for the last 100 years may not exactly make any more economic sense because technology's changed, just like it does in many other industries. So I think it matters on the fuel source, but I think we need that interconnected system less and less. We need a balance between centralized and decentralized. If you look at Puerto Rico, it's a good example of that, and an island can give you a good example of that. Balance is what we need instead of all centralized, in my opinion.
So I would add just one thing. For those of you that don't know the Mike Skelly story, Clean Line Energy, the idea there and the benefit there was to take very cheap, very robust wind energy in western Oklahoma and western Kansas and bring it to TVA and bring it to the Chicago markets, basically. I mean, the upper Midwest there, which would have been, I think, if they could, and they might pull off one of the lines still. There's a wonderful book written about it, which I would highly recommend. So there was some benefit, but John's right about in New England. We anticipate doubling the amount of electricity we are going to use to decarbonize the New England economy, which is all the rage of policymakers, environmentalists. And the latest technology that policymakers have glommed onto is offshore wind, looking at what's happened in Europe, the substantial growth of offshore wind. In Europe, it is not something that exists in the United States in any kind of way, but it will, and there will be some big projects, I think, in New England that'll bring in energy. But we're tiny compared to ERCOT. We're like a 28,000 megawatt system, 30,000 megawatt system, and we're going to add 2,500 megawatts of wind, offshore wind, if we're lucky, by 2024. And we want to increase that. And electricity is going to double if we try to decarbonize by 2030. There's no way in the world to do that without bringing down power from Hydro-Quebec, which is this massive hydro system just to the northwest of the New England region. Absolutely no way to do that. And what's the problem? There's no way to get that power down. There's big controversy now in the state of Maine on a line that would connect Hydro-Quebec to the New England Independent System Operator. There was a prior big utility, Eversource, biggest one in the region, spent 4 years developing a line that everybody thought would be permitted to come down to New Hampshire and bring 1,000 megawatts of Hydro-Quebec power, which Hydro-Quebec has won in a clean RFP, if you will. Won the right to do, I should say. And it lost in a New Hampshire Siting Board vote 7-0 after 4 years of intense permitting. So it's a huge challenge. And if you read the book about Clean Line Energy, Mike Skelly and his team ran smack into that, as well as what John was talking about, just going into different utility systems and different utility regulation regimes was really daunting. It's hard to see that we'll be able to actually pull that off.
If there's still time, John, it would be great to get your opinion, given that you live this every single day, right? Some of the comments to behind the meter net metering, certainly at the residential level, are around access and financial access across different socioeconomic bands. Obviously, with the community solar and other access points, there starts to be sort of an answer to that. But how do you work, within your company to make it not just something that's available to those that have either the credit or the capital to be able to afford a net metering system?
Yeah. So the question is, how do we address on residential solar and storage all credit stratas, right?
All credit
Income.
stratas and this is not working, socioeconomic levels and access, right? So you have renewable power and then the capability for particularly lower socioeconomic classes to access, what to higher economic classes are tax credits and a valuable lowering of electricity costs.
Yeah. So first of all, in regards to tax credits and accessing that, it is true, I think, roughly what 55% of the population doesn't pay any taxes. So it's a little hard if you don't pay taxes to monetize a tax credit. What we do at Sunnova is we do very complex financial structuring to monetize those tax credits for those folks. And it could be that they're simply on retirement, fixed income and so forth. So we do have an answer for that, and we've had an answer for a long period of time. One of the misnomers about residential solar, and we actually had a very spirited debate and discussion about this last year at this panel, is that it's for the, quote, rich folk. Actually, candidly and bluntly, maybe crassly, rich folk don't really care about saving $50 or $75 or $20 a month. It just doesn't matter to them. So if they get around to doing it, it's probably usually for some reason of environmental driven. What I also tell you is that just because you make a lot of money doesn't mean you have good credit. We see that all the time. You may know your friends and neighbors, you'd be surprised. The other side of that is just because you don't make a lot of money doesn't mean you don't have great credit, because maybe you actually can manage a checkbook. So most of our customer base is actually middle class to upper middle class. So we address a very wide income strata. Now, the bottom of the income, fair enough, that is one that, because they do typically have very poor credit. And what I've said all along is that we need to have more regulation in my space. Yeah, I said that. We need to have more structure here, and that if you look at the centralized monopoly system, they have a credit wrap. The state basically, including Texas and the deregulated, so Houston, Dallas, still credit wraps these low-income folks, or bad credit folks is the better way of phrasing it, so that they can still get power. Open it up to the system. Again, this is part of the regulatory and structure change. Stop discriminating and saying, oh, the state's going to allow that only if you have a centralized solution versus a decentralized solution. Some states, as Hawaii, California, and some others, have looked at doing this. We've been very much encouraging more of this to come about. But I really think it's probably going to also need to take some sort of federal leadership as far as how do we make sure that folks that want cheaper, more reliable power that companies like Sunnova can get to them and serve them are allowed to do so without being discriminated against, and they're not forced onto a monopolistic, government-driven, centralized system.
Thanks so much for those comments. I want to make sure we move on to some of these other topics that we've got. Another aspect of the energy transition relates to the economic players, the various different companies of all different sizes that are having an impact on the energy transition. And so one question is sort of, what have been the relative strengths and weaknesses of the majors versus, emerging venture capital companies in driving the transition to renewables? Throw that out to the panel. Hap, maybe you want to get us started?
Sure. First of all, I have to say, coming down from New England, from Boston, it's an honor to be here at the Baker Institute. I chair President Bush 41's foundation, and in that role, I've been privileged to see the relationship between Secretary Baker and President Bush. It's just extraordinary. He's an amazing man, Secretary Baker. Anyway, with that, my background's basically, pay attention when somebody asks you for your bio, because I missed that email. And that bio, I was listening to it, I was like, wow, that's something we put together in 1998. That was a long time ago. I forgot I worked at Knoll International, which was a company we sold to Westinghouse. Anybody remember Westinghouse Electric Company? Anyway, most of my activity has been in either development of power, in wind, solar, hydro, a little bit of biomass. I was on the board of a company that amassed 17% of nuclear, the largest nuclear power plant in New England, Seabrook Power Station, which is now in the hands of NextEra. And then we started a venture capital fund. That was back in 2001, and we raised $850 million over 3 funds, and we're winding down Fund 3. Living in Brookline, Massachusetts, and now in Boston. Cocktail conversation when you say you're investing in clean energy technologies is huge. The people love it. They go, wow, that must be so cool. I say it's very cool, but it's very, very hard to make money in that space. And I think the last 15 years has borne that out across Silicon Valley and elsewhere. So my comments will be perhaps more animated on the venture side, but I've been in the what Liz has named the emerging as well. So first of all, the majors, obviously, I mean, listening to Jason, $2 billion a year in renewable power. The majors have a huge role, and I would define majors as major E&P companies. But also the big national utilities in Europe and the biggest utilities here in the United States, like NextEra. They have an enormous role to play. And for the obvious reasons, they got the balance sheet. They can do $2 billion a year, and it fits in their capital allocation nicely. They also have a spectacular breadth of operations. I mean, for the utilities in the United States, like NextEra, they're primarily nationally focused, but you look at the big utilities in Europe and they're internationally focused. They have a great breadth of operations. These are all very good operating companies for the most part too. John might disagree with U.S. utilities, but they're based, so they bring that kind of maturity to the emerging companies from whence comes a lot of the business that they get. I don't want to touch too much on weaknesses. I think in the past we've seen big companies jump into this space, and there's not really the diligence that they should have done, perhaps, to get into some of the companies or projects they got into. And when you're trying to spend a lot of money, not Shell, but when one's trying to spend a lot of money, sometimes the emphasis on getting money out the door and not necessarily being as thorough and diligent. And there's sort of a sense, there was a sense, I don't think it's so much now, but there was a sense that if a new, particularly big European utility gets into the business, go to them for capital, because they'll be dying to say they've done some deals. So the majors have a huge role to play. And then the major oil companies, just when you think about the importance that offshore wind has in Europe and will have, I think in the United States, that's an absolute natural for the big integrated majors. The emerging business, I would say, is the heart of this business in the United States. It's where it's the entrepreneurial side. Literally, it's hard to believe this, but in my opinion, there's no barrier to entry in this business, none. All you need is some capital, and capital meaning you might need 50,000 or 100,000, and you might want to know somebody who's been in the business so they can tell you that who's who as a development partner. But I mean, the old adage of two people and a dog in a truck is actually, you can do very well doing that. And I can speak to that, having with another partner that used to work for me in a prior life. He and I found out about a pipeline, the Northeastern Maritimes pipeline, that at the time Duke was here in Houston was developing. And I remember saying to them, does anybody know about this? This is the biggest thing in natural gas in New England ever. Who knows about this? And they were saying, well, I don't know. It's all filed at FERC. Go look at it. So we go look at the route and we go, oh my gosh, we should put a natural gas plant there. So we developed and got Duke eventually to back us up. 540 megawatt combined cycle plant outside of Bangor, Maine. And today that would be, with today's technology, that would be almost 1,000 megawatts of capability. And I think I spent $75,000 of my own money on that. So it really is, there's no barriers to entry. But some great companies right here in Houston. Michael Zilka's renewables company became Horizon when they brought Goldman Sachs in, and then and when Goldman Sachs sold it to the Portuguese national utility, which had a renewable subsidiary, EDPR. I mean, it's a perfect example of how you can start, as they did, with one or two very small projects. They of course had natural gas money, the Zilka family, and they poured it into wind. They had a great vision there. Northland Power, if you know that company in Toronto, is a terrific example of another company that just grew brilliantly and quite substantially over a 15-year period. Lincoln Renewables in the solar space. There's a lot of companies. I don't pretend to know anywhere close to all of them. But it's that entrepreneurial drive and a sense that there's just not unlimited, but there's a huge amount of potential for the solar and wind particularly. Back up for 1 second. I don't think you could permit a big hydro project in the United States, just my own personal opinion. I certainly wouldn't want to take that on, unless you're taking an existing core dam and adding generation to it. That's a whole world of environmental issues. In fact, environmentalists in New England and elsewhere, I think, are trying to take dams down to free them up for fish and other reasons, restore them to their natural place. I mean, look at what's gone on in the Columbia River, if you're familiar with that, for the last 40 years. And biomass, on scale, we've been involved in tangentially, a couple 300 megawatt biomass plants. Those are hard to pencil out in this world, especially with the role that renewables are playing, and we'll talk about that in a second. So anyway, the emerging side, there's some substantial companies there that are throwing off substantial amounts of cash, and there are men and women in trucks with dogs driving around trying to do 500 megawatt wind projects and sell them to Shell or others. It's an extraordinary ecosystem. On the venture side, where we've been for 15 years, I would say on the big wind side, there's no role for venture capital at all. It's a very mature, very liquid market. And also you have to keep in mind the product here. A General Electric 1.5 megawatt wind turbine weighs 167 tons between the tower and the nacelle, what's up on top of the tower, and the blade assembly, 167 tons. So you can put, in my opinion, all the fancy sensors and ultra caps you want in that nacelle to drive that turbine and move those blades to shed or capture energy. And you're still stuck with the fact that you got to pay for 167 tons of steel. And it's very hard to innovate your way around that or disrupt your way around that. It just can't be done. And on the solar side, I would say the same thing's true, but we learned the hard way that it's true. So that's a different story on utility scale solar, not the resi business that John's talking about. We were one of the investors in a company called Solyndra, the much maligned Solyndra, but there were 3 or 4 companies exactly like Solyndra, different technologies, but this was an effort to go beyond the sort of monocrystalline panel technology that existed for years and take it to new thin film or new thin film or other materials that would significantly improve the efficiency capture of the panel. Solyndra, I will go to my grave thinking, was a great solution for commercial big warehouse rooftops. But at $340 million in revenue and losing money on every single panel they shipped, they couldn't compete with the Chinese. And the Chinese are the point here. What the Chinese did to that sort of 8-year period was essentially kill it. I would say between Solyndra, Mia Soleil, and Nano Solar, don't quote me on this, please, but I'm guessing $2 billion of private equity, most of it from venture capital firms in Silicon Valley, Austin, Texas, Boston, Massachusetts, was wiped out by the Chinese. And what did the Chinese do? They threw brute force at the issue and built vertically integrated companies, loaded them up with government debt, and just said, as Mark referred to, it was an industrial policy. We will be the big player in solar panels, and they are. And the good news is it brought down the price of panels to a point where companies like John can go to residential customers and make a very compelling proposition to lease panels for their home. So I would say the Chinese killed the venture effort to play a big role on the utility scale solar side. On the resi solar side, actually the business that John's in and other players, Sunrun, Solar City, et cetera, I think venture capital can take some credit for the business model. Or the business model innovation. Certainly it's not an innovation to collect leases and securitize them. The auto industry's been doing that for years. But to do that in the solar space was an innovative step forward, and it is now a very established business. I mean, John's got a company with $1 billion market cap. So I think the VCs can take credit there, but on the utility scale, not so much. We in the venture world, you all know this, the great word is disruption. Uber disrupting, WeWorks was disrupting, might continue to disrupt, we'll see. There wasn't, the large scale wind and large scale solar, as I've said, very, very hard to disrupt for a whole bunch of reasons. But what the result has been quite disruptive. I looked today at the ERCOT load forecast for today. So the Texas system load forecast, and at 5 a.m. it's about 40,000 megawatts of power running, and at 6 p.m. tonight there'll be 66,000 megawatts. So that line goes straight up like this, 45-degree angle. And you compare that to California. And wind, by the way, in Texas, you all know this, right? Wind has finally passed coal in terms of installed capacity. In terms of energy, coal is like 22%, and wind is like 17 or 18, something like that. But still, getting there. In California, they have what's known as the duck curve because of all of the innovation that's come in I would say primarily residential solar, and then the push into utility scale plants. So you have this. So looking at I didn't look at the California ISO, Independent System Operator, website this morning to find the actual load forecast for today. But typically, what happens in their system, thanks to this innovation, is that you start to power up at around 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. You start on this path, and then the sun comes up, and the path goes like this. It goes down, and then around 4:30 in the afternoon, it goes straight up because you need to meet the peak load at 5 to 6 p.m. And people have dubbed it the duck curve. I mean, I'm old enough to say I don't think anyone back in like 1995 or 2000 saw that coming, and the extraordinary operational challenge of meeting that, which Cal ISO's done a great job of doing. And wind, in terms of just disruption here in Texas, with all the wind in West Texas, it's pushed a lot of gas and coal out of off the margin, and they simply can't compete. It's been hugely disruptive. It's a reason that if you follow this kind of stuff, there are relatively new combined cycle plants that are going for relatively cheap money. So, and then I would say lastly in venture, well, two things. One is there's anything with any technology around software and whatnot. Venture capital is very good. There's a lot of that pervades the energy industry. I don't know so much about the oil side of things, but I'm guessing it does. And then on fuels, and I think somebody's going to talk about this later, there's huge collaboration opportunities, obviously, and it's been going on for some time between the major oil companies and a lot of entrepreneurs and some venture capitalists who are trying, like Vinod Khosla and some others, like in the Breakthrough Fund, that are trying to find that magic biofuels play, and it's venture's not done well in the past. We looked at a lot of that stuff and just couldn't see how you could ever get to scale to attract a Shell or an ExxonMobil. But certainly from a collaboration standpoint, they'd be amazing partners. So I guess that's it.
Yep.
I don't know that anything was worthy of
Lots,
remembering.
Lots, I'm sure. No. I didn't know if any of you had any specific.
It's a great ecosystem.
Yes. Sure, John.
What I would say is to build on what Hap said. I think, and I've heard some thoughts about this out there just in general, is that, for instance, storage. Hey, unless there's a major breakthrough, there's all these chemists that say that this is not going to be effective, that the technology won't get there. We said the same thing about solar panels, and having been in manufacturing facilities in China and elsewhere, beware of that assumption. Be very concerned about making that assumption, because what happened here is exactly what Hap just said. The Chinese government decided to own this market, not to say that there's not a lot of other production facilities around the world making solar panels now, but they provided that initial venture capital to push it over, and then the economies of scale took over, an incremental improvement. Every little aspect of the production process that you couldn't foresee, including your scientific community, actually drove solar panels that today you do not need subsidies in any country to make that cost effective. That's stunning. I mean, in fact, the reason why I have to buy 42-cent panels instead of 20-cent panels in India and China, or even a little bit less, is because of the Obama and Trump tariffs. That's it. It's government intervention. So when you look at storage, I'm seeing the same kind of incremental improvement, and it may not apply maybe on a utility scale basis. It could, though, but we're seeing it applied, for instance, on a residential, small commercial basis, and possibly on the transportation side as well. So if you add up, 3, 5, 10, 15% improvement per year, it doesn't seem like a whole lot the first year or the second year, but when you have 10 years of it, you look back and go, oh my gosh, we just reduced cost by 95%. How did we get here? And that's something that is both a opportunity, but a foe as well for investors, and really, you have to take a look and make sure you make your investments with that in mind.
I definitely want to come back to storage, but I want to make sure we've got enough time to cover this other topic as well, because I think it's important, particularly in view of some of the things that have already been discussed, sort of the, the role of oil and gas in the current transition, and in particular, the digital transition, the high-tech transition that we've seen in oil and gas, because, certainly to continue to compete with renewables and to continue to make oil and gas production feasible and profitable, companies in this space have had to get innovative. And so I wanted to pose the question to the panel. Maybe Joanna can start us. How have you seen automation and digital technologies used in the oil and gas industry in particular, and how widely have those been adopted in general?
Sure thing. Great. So full disclosure, I no longer do digital, but I do think it's an important topic and one that has gotten a lot of attention. If you look at the last two Sarah Week conferences, one was on digitalization, and the very next year in energy transition. There are two different transitions, and arguably you could ask the exact same question that Mark asked at the beginning, which is, which digitalization transition are we talking about? And I bring this up because if you look back, say 5-6 years to the GE digital marketing machine, and you go read those documents, you'll see a lot on asset integrity, a lot on predictive maintenance, and it really is the poster child for the opportunity that big data exists. You have very complex engines, much to the indication about a wind turbine, right? You have a very high value asset that can be heavily instrumented, controlled by one country, produced by one company, produced by one company, or under the auspices of a single company, and then leased into the market under its control. You have the opportunity to really and truly bring in big data across an entire asset fleet, and that's been going on for a very long time. The predictive maintenance and asset integrity theme has already pre-existed. The same thing actually exists in the oil field. I used to work for Aramco, and if you compared U.S. shale instrumentation, connectivity, sensors versus what's used in very large bore wells in the Middle East and offshore, those things are highly wired, highly censored, and they have been for some time. There's certainly areas for opportunities for increased, as you see a decreased cost in sensors, for an increased use of them, but fundamentally there is a digitalization that has pre-existed. Where I think you see the true change is in jumping out of that box. So if you take the U.S. shale market, where you have assets that flip from owner to owner, you've got the coil guy, the wired guy, the drilling guy, the mud guy, the water guy, the horsepower guy, right? They're all there on the wellhead. They all need to integrate all of their data. And in order to truly look at what did we do in this well to the next, to the next, to the next, what is happening on production from one to the next to the next, that's the opportunity to where new, cheaper sensors and this ability to innovate and provide a greater connectivity that hasn't existed across multiple lower cost assets is really where the digitalization is coming in. I think there's some pretty interesting companies that are out there in spaces that you wouldn't necessarily think of. So flexible workforce. So, to my point of individual, all the different groups that have to come in on maintenance before, after, during completion or drilling, you have a flexible workforce. You need to ensure that all those people are the right people entering, and you need to make sure that they are properly certified. And then sort of digital worker passport firms that are making quite a lot of progress here in Houston right now with some of the larger oil majors as they look to be able to certify that as they look at their global workforce that's on their sites, that they're certain they've got the right people. You've also got many of the other areas where people have spent quite a lot of time, remote sensing, and some of the earliest pitches, at least that I saw on this sort of lighter asset, was, is the rod pump moving? Because it stops, no one's there, it's 10 miles from something and no one knows if it's moving. So it's attaching a Raspberry Pi, very simple operations, and they're beginning as they tie into SCADA and PLC to provide greater and greater access and visibility. You're also seeing machine learning and true AI being put onto edge instruments. So instead of taking all of your data from your wellhead or from your renewable site and putting it up in the cloud, to be able to run basic analytics and true compressed ML files on small computer modeling hardware that is placed exactly at the site of the PLC or SCADA or miniaturized. If you start to think about, as you piece those together, the greater sensors, the cheaper sensors, better connectivity, and the ability to run more and more complex ML and AI processes at smaller and smaller scales at cheaper and cheaper value, you really start to see that while the capabilities are there, it's the tying and the weaving of those different elements that is still only in its very infancy and will continue to accelerate over the next 10 years. All of the majors have announced major programs within digitalization. And if you as well look at true big data, so what you think about of, Intel running commercials with something that looks like the Matrix, right? But that type does start to exist. It's interoperability between different data silos within the company, and typically exceedingly hard to do. The groups like Palantir that have done it in cyber and had done it in Homeland Security, there are parallels in the oil field that are beginning to connect all of the data. To beginning to be able to parse out from scanned PDFs from the 1940s, look at the different leases and pull out the lease clauses that are most standard as people start to look at buying, selling assets. It's a great and complex problem. And some of those majors, you can imagine, if you've spent millions of dollars buying the software and probably more millions implementing the software so that you can be the best bidder in a certain part of the shale. Are you going to really share that? So there is a problem when you get to that big data integration that's quite difficult, in that you're going to have some defenses that come up. But I do think that on the connectivity to better run assets, there's certainly a lot of interest. So two things that particularly tie back to the energy transition, to how do you decarbonize the space. I work with our partners. We're a private equity fund based here in Houston, specifically focused on decarbonization of the industrial sector. So we do not work necessarily in wind or power generation, but in all the other things, including waste, that are significant contributors to CO2. And if you look where you could start to actually implement some of these digital strategies to better contribute to a decarbonization across industry, one of them we all walk straight past on the way in. Greater sensors. So there's a variety of new sensors out there, both for multispectral and infrared. They're getting cheaper. Digital processing on even visual cameras and IR cameras across multiple cameras, being able to frame that scene and do calculations of methane clouds and other emission clouds across multiple low-cost cameras is, again, another area from digitization and advanced video analytics that is directly applicable into the oil and gas space. So those are great opportunities to look for emissions, to better track them, and arguably, as pressure comes down on gas and gas emissions and whether or not it has a true role as a transition fuel, which arguably, again, from everyone we've heard today, it very much is. But I think if you look at the purists on the renewable side, there may be questions to that. And the truth is that in order to have a well-regulated generation set, gas is going to be there for some time. The opportunity is here in Houston and with the oil majors and as well as the independent operators who know their systems best on how to do that. And I think sensors, drones, cameras, video analytics are great examples where that actually, the two themes merge together. And then you've got old technology that is known and that is out there, where it is very well known to the operators where methane emissions are. It's well known in boosting stations, compressing stations, and other hardware, where I think there's a tremendous opportunity to really take a step forward, both in old technology and in new, to be able to provide a decarbonization to some extent, both of the production and of the transmission of natural gas. And it's all well known and well documented. So those are true opportunities, I think, that exist. The last one I want to raise, and I think one we had a conversation on in the hallway just before I came in, is cybersecurity. So as you look at either a decentralization of generation or the greater connectivity in the oil field. Industrial cybersecurity is a massive issue. Many of you may be familiar with the Stuxnet impacts about 2 years ago. A Schneider safety control system in a petrochemical facility in Saudi Arabia was attacked behind the air gap with no personnel access to the computers. Most of the diagnostics on that attack obviously are classified and hard to get a hold of, but certainly those attacks are real. The U.S. electrical grid, but also if you start to think about independents installing vast numbers of sensors, remotely controllable valves across the U.S. shale, there's a real need to take a hard look at cybersecurity from the beginning, because as we become more decentralized and in some cases better operating because of these capabilities, we also have to be ahead, not only in where our emissions might come from, where our solar panels come from, where they might go at the end, but also on the digital side, overlapping what the new vulnerabilities are on the cybersecurity side.
Thank you. Before we move on, any particular comments we wanted to make? I do want to come back to the battery topic, but I want to make sure that okay, great. So lastly, and we touched on this a little bit already, sort of the battery and storage challenges, another area where sort of the technology is sort of in its nascent stages, but it's certainly become a bigger issue in the energy transition. And so I'd kind of like to get the panel's thoughts, John, starting with you, sort of why has battery technology become such an important part? And you alluded to some of the challenges that we have already, and sort of if you could give us an idea of what those challenges are, the overview.
Yeah, so now that I do run a publicly traded company, I have to be careful what I say, but we have reported that up till Q2, and we expected that trend to continue to accelerate, that 11% of all of our customers were sold with batteries. And indeed, our customer base was just under 2% penetration of batteries. Given the size of our customer base of north of 70,000, that's a pretty good amount of storage relative to and I remember 2 years ago talking about on this very stage where it was debated whether storage would even ever take off at all. And there was a lot of, science and a bunch of things thrown against it. What I can tell you is the price curve is dropped dramatically. And what you possibly hear, and I love and giving this example, is for those of you that work in the major oil companies or in the private equity firms, what you will do is you will go over to China or the fund managers and Korea and other places where the batteries are made, and you will talk to the manufacturers and you will ask them, what's your price? And they will give you a price. They will also tell you that you need to buy now because the price is actually going to go up because lithium is in short supply. Now, if you look at the price of lithium, it's done nothing but collapse in the last 2 years. If you are a manufacturer of a widget, of any widget, and some buyer is coming into you, are you going to say, hey, you really shouldn't buy now. You should wait because this thing's dropping like a brick in water? No. And then you, candidly, as the investor that has legacy investments and other things that may be competitive, are going to hear what you want to hear. There are real problems. The pricing's not coming down, blah, blah, blah. You're going to go back and go, oh, thank God. But you didn't get the truth. When you show up with several $100 million like we do and go, now really, what's the cost? You get a very different price. And what I would say is that what we're seeing when cold hard cash trade hands is something that's far more aggressive than what I thought at the beginning of this year. And so what we're seeing is that adoption rate for residential with certain technology companies, Tesla is a big one, and that is our big partner, but LG of Korea and so forth, is it really coming out with both capabilities, so the energy density is increasing, and pricing, so that consumers are not, in some cases, starting to buy more than one battery for the home. They're buying two, and indeed we've already sold, in some cases, some customers that get up to 4 batteries. So that transition is taking place. It's necessary because without it, you really depend upon a policy that, again, we talked about, net metering, and some other policies out there to support the growth of solar. The old adage that you say around Houston, what you gonna do when the sun don't shine and the wind don't blow? Well, now, as you remember, you have an answer. It's storage, and it's coming pretty rapidly, particularly in your low energy usage customers, like a residential, customer. So we've got a long ways to go still. I would say that. But let me define long. I don't think this is going to take anywhere close to 10 years to get price competitiveness. And it does depend on the market. So there's a very big difference between Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and California to Texas, or Texas to Arizona. And indeed, what we're also seeing is as the storm frequency, which the city knows very well, increases, that people are paying a little bit more for that storage for the reliability. And if you think that a diesel genset's going to do everything for you, go talk to our customers in Puerto Rico. Diesel was in very short supply to not getting it, and so you couldn't run that generator but for a few hours when they needed a few days or weeks or months. So there are solutions where customers are coming in, not unlike the Tesla car, and buying it more and paying more because of features or services that they can't get from the conventional technology that are not fully thought out as far as competitive weapons. We're seeing that in residential storage with regards to reliability and other capabilities that we can provide our customers that a centralized power system simply cannot.
Hap, did you have a comment there at the end?
I would say that I agree with everything John said. I might change some of the adverbs and adjectives to be a little more incremental on what's happening with lithium ion, but definitely the curve's like this. It's not like this, which is great. There's a special graveyard in the venture world for battery technology startups we didn't manage to avoid Solyndra, but we managed to avoid those. Nonetheless, hope springs eternal, and there are some very, very big funds, not venture funds per se, but like the Breakthrough Fund, which is Bill Gates and Michael Bloomberg and a whole bunch of very wealthy folks that are trying to find those breakthrough technologies that are investing in battery technologies, and the hope there is that there's some fundamental chemistry breakthrough that leads you to beyond the lithium-ion world. But it's remarkable what's happened in the lithium-ion, and it's a lot like what the Chinese did in the solar space. I mean, just a lot of this is just building very large entities that can drive the cost incrementally down continually. Last thing I'll say is when you hear things like somebody said to me the other day. As an example, well, what about the Tesla battery in South Australia? It was huge, and I said, oh yeah, I remember that. I remember that play. I mean that project that they did. And they said, so how do you build a battery that big? I said, you take a lot of Tesla car batteries and you add them all together and you put them in large storage. That's how you do it. And it's not trivial trying to keep those that expanse of batteries operating smoothly and keeping the temperatures low and making. I mean, it's significantly difficult to do that. So I don't mean to demean that, but that's what when we're still at the stage that big batteries are like a whole lot of little batteries that are made up into one big battery, and we've got to. John's onto something great, which is that individual customers are using storage, which is fabulous. When you're talking about 1,000 megawatt, when you're talking about 15,000 megawatts of wind in West Texas going off the line when a front comes through and the wind stops completely, that's a different challenge. That's a whole different challenge for storage, and getting there is going to require the Shells of the world with the balance sheets that they have to get us through this challenge and figure out the next gen of battery storage.
Just one thing I would add, when it comes to the comparison, I think it's quite right. So I had the opportunity about nearly 10 years ago now to work competitive intel for First Solar, which is the only thin film solar developer, solar panel manufacturer that survived, and to my knowledge, the only existing US-based manufacturer of solar panels on a major scale today. Ish.
SunPower's got a plant.
Yeah, at full utilization. But one thing that I think that is particularly important, it's not just about the states backing the manufacturing, about the Chinese state backing the manufacturing facility, it's the ability to take losses. Because if you look at how these are made via pouch cells and put into stacks, you could have a yield of, say, 50% that actually are good and have high yield. This happened for certain in solar, and you take all the good ones and you put them in the panels and you send them overseas. And you can win. If you're able to take losses on your facilities, you can send the good ones over and you can drive new techs in at lower and lower costs because you're able to take those losses or get additional capital to be able to have those lower utilizations. So I think it's, if you start to look at what has happened in crystalline silicon, even in the past 5 years, and the innovation around dual-sided, the innovation of PERC actually getting put in because the Chinese government said you must have PERC type solar cells if you want to be in this market. That PERC had existed since 1989. It's not a new thing. It got implemented because of a policy within China and because their willingness to support as those manufacturing facilities not only put in the capex to build the PERC cells, but took the yield losses that they needed when they first brought up those facilities. If you transition that to batteries, arguably they're already much further ahead, and their ability to implement new technologies, both throughout Asia and the tier 1 suppliers into those pouch cells is very likely to drive down costs for firms like John's, and frankly for all. The real issue then becomes how do we ensure that those are coming from the right place? How do we have security of supply? And where do they go in the end when you have a relatively short life of the asset and larger and larger numbers of those being produced? But I think it's, if you actually look into the details of how Chinese solar was driven down, and exactly the same playbook for what is these individual units being put together in energy storage, it's going to be an interesting 5 years.
Well, thank you very much. Fortunately or unfortunately, we had such wonderful comments. We've run out of time and don't have too much time for questions. But if you'll join me in thanking this panel for their incredible comments. So we'll have the film that was spoken about before during our break. The next session will start at 10:30, but please enjoy the film as well. Thank you.